There is a particular kind of person who has probably spent years feeling guilty about themselves. They have ideas constantly. They imagine businesses they could build, videos they could make, books they could write, music they could produce, paintings they could create, projects that could completely change their life. They can see the finished thing in their head with almost uncomfortable clarity. They know what they want it to look like. They can explain it to somebody else. They can become genuinely excited about it. And then they don't do it. They tell themselves they will start tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes next week. Next week becomes next month. The idea remains alive, but the work never quite begins. And eventually a word starts appearing in their head. Lazy. Maybe that's what you are. Maybe you're talented but undisciplined. Maybe you're creative but incapable of following through. Maybe you simply don't want it badly enough. But what if that explanation is wrong? What if the strange gap between how much you can imagine and how little you actually produce isn't evidence that you're lazy? What if, in some cases, creativity itself is part of the problem? Because a creative mind has an unusual ability that most productivity advice completely ignores. It can generate alternatives faster than it can commit to one. You sit down to write, and you don't see one possible sentence, you see 20. You sit down to design something, and immediately imagine 5 different directions. You start planning a business, and within 10 minutes you've thought of 3 better business models, 2 different audiences, another niche, and a completely unrelated idea that suddenly seems more exciting. From the outside, this looks like procrastination. From inside your head, it can feel like having too many doors open at once. And when every door contains something interesting, choosing one can feel strangely like killing all the others. That's the first thing I want you to understand. The creative person doesn't always struggle because there is nothing to do. Sometimes they struggle because there are too many possible things to do. This creates a psychological trap. The more imaginative you are, the easier it becomes to experience the future before you've earned it. You can mentally hear the song before recording it. You can see the finished film before shooting it. You can imagine the audience reaction before publishing anything. You can picture the business succeeding before you've made the first sale. Your mind can simulate the reward long before reality has required you to do the boring middle, and that creates a dangerous imbalance. The fantasy is immediate, the work is delayed. The fantasy is clean, the work is messy. The fantasy contains no technical problems, no rejection, no revisions, no awkward first draft. No people telling you that your idea isn't as good as you thought. The fantasy asks almost nothing from you. The real thing asks for everything, so you return to the fantasy. And because the fantasy feels productive, you can spend years confusing mental activity with actual progress. This is why one of the most painful experiences for a creative person is opening the project after thinking about it for weeks. In your imagination, the project was enormous. In reality, you need to make one decision, write one paragraph, choose one font, record one terrible take, draw one rough shape, edit one scene, and suddenly the grand vision has become a tiny physical action. The distance between those two things can feel disappointing. Your imagination was cinematic. Reality is administrative. You weren't expecting creativity to involve file names, revisions, bad drafts, unanswered emails, awkward prototypes, boring research, technical mistakes, and hours where nothing seems to happen. But that's what creation actually is. The finished work is the visible part. The invisible part is thousands of decisions that were too ordinary to ever appear in the final product. And this is where many creative people make their first mistake. They judge the quality of their first attempt against the quality of the thing they imagined. That's an impossible competition. Your imagination has unlimited editing power. It can instantly remove the bad sentence, improve the lighting, fix the melody, sharpen the argument, make the character more interesting, make the painting more beautiful. Reality doesn't work that way. Reality makes you produce the bad version first, and then you improve it. The problem is that perfectionism often disguises itself as high standards. You tell yourself you care about quality. Sometimes you do. But sometimes what you call standards is simply a sophisticated way of avoiding the moment when your imagination has to become measurable. Because the moment an idea becomes real, it becomes judgeable. While the idea exists only in your head, it is perfect. Nobody can reject it. Nobody can criticize it. Nobody can misunderstand it. Nobody can tell you that the song isn't good. The book isn't ready. The business doesn't work. The painting doesn't communicate what you intended, or the video isn't interesting. The imaginary version is protected from reality. The real version isn't. And this means procrastination can sometimes protect something more valuable than your time. It protects your self-image. If you never finish, you never have to discover whether your imagined ability is actually equal to your real ability. That is why some of the most creative people can become experts at preparing to create. They research endlessly. They buy equipment. They organize folders. They watch tutorials. They redesign their workspace. They make mood boards. They build elaborate systems. They plan the perfect schedule. They choose the perfect software. They consume another 100 pieces of information, and all of it feels productive because it is related to the thing. But there is a difference between activity around the work and the work itself. You can spend an entire day sharpening pencils without drawing anything. You can spend 6 months researching a book without writing a chapter. You can spend a year learning about filmmaking without filming the scene you already know you want to make. Preparation becomes particularly dangerous when it gives you the emotional satisfaction of progress without the psychological risk of production.
And this is where your brain's calculation of effort becomes relevant. Psychologist Robert Kurzban and colleagues proposed an opportunity cost account of subjective mental effort in which the unpleasantness of effort can partly reflect the perceived value of alternative activities. The model is theoretical and debated, but it offers a useful lens. When a task feels effortful, your mind isn't necessarily reporting that your resources are physically empty. It may be evaluating whether continuing this task is worth the cost relative to other possibilities. For a creative person, that comparison can be especially crowded. You're not just comparing writing this paragraph against doing nothing. You're comparing it against the other idea you could pursue, the video you could watch, the research rabbit hole you could enter, the business you could plan, the message you could answer, the new project that suddenly feels more exciting. Your mind has options. And options create competition. This is why sometimes you can work for 3 hours on something you find fascinating and then stare at a blank document for 20 minutes when the task is technically easier. The difference isn't always energy. Sometimes it's perceived value. You can be exhausted and still play a game for another hour because the next action is obvious and the feedback is immediate. You can be well rested and unable to write because the task is ambiguous, the reward is distant, and every mistake is visible to you. So when you say, "I'm too lazy to do this," try asking a different question. What exactly is expensive about starting? Is the task boring? Is it unclear? Is the outcome uncertain? Are you afraid it won't be good? Are there too many choices? Are you tired? Are you secretly hoping to do something else? The word lazy gives you none of these answers. It simply ends the investigation. And sometimes the problem is much smaller than the project you've assigned yourself. Write my book isn't an action. Build my company isn't an action. Make a great YouTube video isn't an action. Your brain cannot execute a category. It can execute a behavior. Open the document. Write the first sentence. Create the first thumbnail sketch. Record 30 seconds. Send one email. Name the file. Put the first image on the timeline. When a task is vague, starting requires you to invent the instructions while you're already trying to perform them. That creates friction. One reason implementation intentions are useful is that they turn vague intentions into specific situations and actions. Gulitzer and Sheeran's meta-analysis found that specifying when and how an intended behavior would occur was associated with stronger goal attainment than simply holding a general intention. The important lesson isn't that you need a complicated productivity system. It's almost the opposite. Your creative life may need fewer decisions at the moment of starting. Don't tell yourself, "I'll work on the documentary tomorrow." Tell yourself exactly what happens. After breakfast, I sit at the desk, open the project, and write one paragraph before doing anything else. Don't tell yourself, "I'll work on the music tonight." Decide which instrument, which project, which file, and what the first physical action is. Creativity needs freedom during creation. It often needs structure before creation. The goal isn't to make creativity rigid. The goal is to remove the unnecessary negotiations that happen before creativity gets a chance to begin. And then there is your phone. You already know this part, but probably not in the way you think. The problem isn't simply that your phone wastes time. The deeper problem is that it provides an immediate alternative whenever creative work becomes uncomfortable. You sit down. The first sentence feels difficult. Your hand moves toward the phone. You check something. Nothing important happened, but the discomfort disappeared. That is enough. The brain has learned that difficult work can be escaped instantly. You don't need to consciously decide to procrastinate. You only need a moment of friction and an available escape route.
Research by Adrian Ward and colleagues found that the mere presence of one's own smartphone could reduce available cognitive capacity in controlled experiments, even when participants were not actively using the device. The study does not prove that smartphones destroy creativity or intelligence, but it does suggest that a device associated with constant information and connection can compete for limited cognitive resources simply by being present. For creative work, that matters because creativity requires sustained internal attention. The phone represents an external world that is always available. Your unfinished idea has to compete with everything that could happen on the screen. And there is another reason scrolling is so effective at stealing creative time. Your imagination is one of your greatest strengths, and the feed gives that imagination an endless supply of material. You see a filmmaker and imagine making films. You see an entrepreneur and imagine building a company. You see an artist and imagine becoming an artist. You see someone else's finished work and immediately experience the emotional possibility of having something similar. This can feel inspiring. Sometimes it is. But inspiration can become a substitute for production. You consume the feeling of creativity instead of tolerating the process of creating. You can watch 10 videos about people who built successful channels and feel strangely productive without making one video. You can save hundreds of references for your novel without writing the first page. You can collect tutorials about drawing without drawing badly enough to improve. The brain receives evidence that you are moving toward the identity you want, even though the physical evidence of progress remains almost unchanged. This is why consuming creative content all day can sometimes leave a creative person feeling more motivated and less productive at the same time. You have fed the identity without feeding the craft. And that leads to something even more uncomfortable. Maybe you don't actually want the work. Maybe you want what the work represents. You want to be a writer, but you don't want to sit alone revising the same chapter 12 times. You want to be a filmmaker, but you don't want to organize footage at midnight. You want to be an entrepreneur, but you don't want to hear no from 20 customers. You want to be an artist, but you don't want to make ugly work while developing your eye. You want the identity. You want the freedom, recognition, respect, money, audience, or meaning attached to the identity. But the reality of the identity is made from repetitive actions that rarely resemble the fantasy. This is one of the most important tests you can perform on yourself. Separate the dream from the daily activity required to make the dream real. If you love the idea of writing but hate the physical act of writing, that's information. If you love having songs but hate practicing an instrument, that's information. If you love the idea of owning a company but hate selling, talking to customers, and solving boring operational problems, that's information. It doesn't automatically mean you should quit. It means you need to stop confusing admiration for an outcome with attraction to the process that produces it. Because sometimes what looks like laziness is actually misalignment. And if that's the case, More discipline won't solve the problem. Discipline can force you to continue doing something you don't want. It cannot tell you whether the thing deserves your life. You can become extremely productive at building somebody else's dream. You can become impressively disciplined while moving in completely the wrong direction. That's why the goal isn't simply to become a person who works harder, it's to become a person who knows what deserves sustained effort. But let's assume the dream is yours. You genuinely want the work. You think about it when you're not doing it. You would regret never making it. Then why do you still avoid it? One answer is fear. Not necessarily dramatic fear. Sometimes it's quiet enough that you mistake it for laziness. Fear of being bad. Fear of being judged. Fear of discovering that you're ordinary. Fear that someone else will do it better. Fear that the idea won't survive contact with reality. Fear that if you succeed, your life will actually have to change. Fear that if you fail publicly, you will have to explain yourself. The easiest way to avoid all of those possibilities is not to fail, it's to never finish. If the work remains unfinished, the verdict remains suspended. You can always tell yourself, I could have done it if I really tried. That sentence is incredibly protective. It allows your potential to remain perfect because potential has never been tested. The moment you publish, launch, submit, perform, or release, the world gets a vote. Until then, you can remain extraordinary in theory, and creative people are particularly vulnerable to this because creativity exposes the self. A spreadsheet can be wrong without feeling like a judgment of your identity. A painting can feel like a judgment of your taste. A novel can feel like a judgment of your intelligence. A song can feel like a judgment of your emotional honesty. A video can feel like a judgment of whether anyone cares what you have to say. So procrastination can become emotional armor. You tell yourself you're lazy because lazy is easier to tolerate than I'm scared that this won't be good enough. Once you see that, the solution changes. You don't need to bully yourself into working. You need to make the work safe enough to begin badly. Give yourself permission to produce a version that nobody needs to see. Create the terrible first draft. Make the ugly sketch. Record the embarrassing take. Write the paragraph that you know you will rewrite tomorrow. The first version isn't supposed to prove your talent. It's supposed to give your talent something to work with. This is also why unfinished work can sometimes be useful. The classic Zeigarnik effect. The idea that unfinished tasks can remain cognitively active has a long history, but the literature is more complicated than the popular internet version suggests. And a recent meta-analysis found that the memory advantage for unfinished tasks has been difficult to replicate consistently. A related tendency to resume interrupted tasks, the Ovsiankina effect, is also studied separately, so don't turn never finish anything into another productivity superstition. But there is a practical idea worth keeping. Stopping with a clear next step can reduce the psychological distance between today's work and tomorrow's work. Think about the difference between these two situations. You finish your work completely. You close the laptop. Tomorrow, you return to a blank project and ask, where was I? Or, you stop after writing 3 paragraphs while knowing exactly what paragraph 4 needs to say. The second situation leaves a bridge behind you. You don't have to reconstruct the entire mental context. You simply cross back into it. That's why creative rituals can matter. The goal isn't to wait for motivation. It's to make re-entry familiar. And there is another enemy hiding here, the fantasy of the perfect creative session. You imagine sitting down for 4 uninterrupted hours, feeling inspired, drinking coffee, producing brilliant work while time disappears. Sometimes that happens. Most of the time, real creative work is much less cinematic. You spend 15 minutes doing something badly. You get stuck. You solve one tiny problem. You walk around. You return. You change something. You hate it. You fix it. You discover something interesting. You continue. The session doesn't feel magical while you're inside it, The finished work can be magical because thousands of ordinary moments accumulated. This is where the psychology of flow becomes useful, but also where the internet often misunderstands it. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi described flow as a state of deep involvement in which attention becomes highly absorbed in an activity. One important part of the model is the relationship between challenge and skill. If the task is too easy, boredom can dominate. If it is far beyond your current ability, anxiety can take over. The sweet spot is challenging enough to require your abilities without overwhelming them. And this explains something many creative people experience without understanding it. Sometimes you aren't lazy, you're working at the wrong difficulty. If the task is too vague, you're overwhelmed. If it's too easy, you're bored. If the stakes are too high, you're anxious. If the feedback is delayed, you're discouraged. So you keep searching for motivation when the actual problem is task design. Instead of make a great painting, give yourself a smaller challenge. Instead of write the best opening possible, write 3 deliberately bad openings. Instead of finish the film, edit 1 scene. Instead of build the company, speak to 1 potential customer. You aren't lowering your ambition, you're lowering the activation energy required to enter the work. And here's the paradox: the smaller the beginning, the easier it can become to continue. You don't need to feel inspired before starting. You need to make starting so specific that your brain has nothing to negotiate. Open the document. Put the cursor at the end of the last sentence. Write 1 sentence. That's it. You can stop afterward, but very often, once action has begun, the psychological landscape changes. The task is no longer imaginary. You have something to respond to. A sentence creates another sentence. A sketch creates another decision. A rough melody creates a problem to solve. Creation becomes easier when there is something concrete in front of you. This is why I don't want you to ask, how do I become more motivated? Ask, how do I make the next action obvious? Motivation is unreliable. Clarity is more dependable. You can feel uninspired and still open the file. You can feel afraid and still write 50 words. You can doubt yourself and still make the rough cut. The goal isn't to eliminate resistance. It's to stop treating resistance as an instruction, because this may be the biggest mistake creative people make. They interpret every feeling as information about what they should do. I don't feel like writing, therefore I shouldn't write. I'm not inspired, therefore the idea isn't ready. I'm tired, therefore I can't work. I'm bored, therefore this project isn't for me. Feelings are real. They are also not always accurate forecasts of what you will experience 5 minutes after beginning. Sometimes you feel resistance because the work is wrong. Sometimes you feel resistance because the work is difficult. Sometimes you feel resistance because you're afraid. Sometimes you feel resistance because you're tired. Sometimes you feel resistance because the reward is too far away. And sometimes you feel resistance because your phone has trained you to expect stimulation every few seconds. The feeling itself doesn't tell you which explanation is correct. You have to investigate. That is why the question, "Am I lazy?" is almost useless. Replace it with better questions. What am I avoiding? What exactly feels difficult? Is the task unclear? Is the standard impossible? Am I afraid of judgment? Am I distracted? Do I actually want the outcome? Do I enjoy the process enough to repeat it? What would make the first 10 minutes easier? And if nobody ever saw the finished product, would I still want to make it? That last question can expose more than you expect. Imagine that you finish the project and nobody applauds. No likes, no money, no followers, no recognition. Nobody even knows you made it. Would you still want it to exist? If the answer is yes, you have something powerful. You may not be lazy. You may simply need to protect that desire from everything that makes the work feel heavier than it needs to be. But if the answer is no, that's useful too. Maybe you've been chasing an identity that looked impressive from the outside. Maybe you don't want to write the book. You want to be known as someone who wrote a book. Maybe you don't want to build a business. You want the freedom you imagine successful founders have. Maybe you don't want to make art. You want the recognition associated with being an artist. There's nothing shameful about discovering that. It is far better to discover it now than to spend 10 years punishing yourself for failing to pursue a goal you never truly chose. And this brings us to the title of this video. If you are creative but lazy, maybe the most important thing you can do is stop calling yourself lazy long enough to find out what is actually happening, because the label creates a closed loop. You don't work, you call yourself lazy. The label creates shame. Shame makes starting harder. You avoid the work. The avoidance becomes evidence that the label was correct. Then the cycle repeats. The diagnosis creates the symptom it claims to explain. You don't break that cycle by becoming crueler to yourself. You break it by becoming more precise. If you're tired, address the tiredness. If you're afraid, name the fear. If the task is vague, define the next action. If the phone is stealing your attention, remove it from the room. If perfectionism is stopping you, deliberately make something bad. If the project is too large, shrink the entry point. If you don't actually want the project, admit it. Precision gives you something shame never can, a problem you can actually solve. And you should also understand that creativity isn't a permanent state of inspiration. It's a relationship with repetition. You create when the idea is exciting. You create when the idea is boring. You create when the first draft is terrible. You create when the 10th revision is frustrating. You create when nobody is watching. You create when you aren't sure whether the work will matter. That's what separates having creative potential from building a creative life. Your ideas are not your work. Your taste is not your work. Your imagination is not your work. Your potential is not your work. They are raw materials. The work begins when something leaves your head and enters the world, and that transition will always feel uncomfortable, because imagination has no friction, reality does. Imagination lets you become a writer without writing. Reality asks for the sentence. Imagination lets you become a filmmaker without filming. Reality asks for the first shot. Imagination lets you become an artist without making ugly work. Reality asks for the first mark. Imagination lets you become an entrepreneur without hearing no. Reality asks you to make the offer. And that is the price of being creative. You have to repeatedly cross the distance between what you can imagine and what you can actually produce. So stop waiting for the version of yourself who wakes up one morning with perfect discipline. That person probably isn't coming. Build a system that works for the person you are today. Make the next action tiny. Make the environment quiet. Put the phone somewhere you cannot casually reach it. Decide in advance when the work begins. Give yourself permission to make a bad first version. Stop before you're completely empty when you know what comes next. And most importantly, stop using your feelings as the final authority on whether you should begin. You don't have to feel creative to create. You don't have to feel confident to begin. You don't have to believe the project will succeed. You don't even have to believe you're talented. You only need to be willing to make the next physical move. Because eventually something strange happens when you do that repeatedly. The identity begins to change. You stop being the person who has ideas and become the person who finishes things. You stop describing the project and start showing it. You stop collecting inspiration and start producing evidence. You stop asking whether you're talented and start discovering what your talent can actually become after hundreds of repetitions. And perhaps that's the real distinction between a creative person and a productive creative person. It isn't that one has more ideas. It isn't that one is more disciplined. It isn't even that one is more motivated. The difference is that one has learned to tolerate the moment when imagination becomes work. That moment will never become completely comfortable, and it doesn't need to. The goal isn't to eliminate laziness forever. The goal is to become good at recognizing what the feeling is actually telling you. Sometimes it means rest. Sometimes it means change. Sometimes it means fear. Sometimes it means the task is badly designed. Sometimes it means you don't want the goal. And sometimes it means you're standing exactly one uncomfortable step away from something you genuinely care about. So the next time you sit down to create and hear that familiar voice saying, "I don't feel like it," don't immediately obey it. Don't immediately fight it either. Ask it a better question. What exactly am I resisting? Maybe the answer will surprise you. Maybe you're overwhelmed because the project is too vague. Maybe you're afraid because the work is finally becoming real. Maybe you're distracted because your environment has trained you to escape every moment of friction. Maybe you're trying to live up to an identity you never chose. Maybe you're demanding perfection from a first draft. Or maybe you really do need to walk away from the project, but you'll never know which one it is if you keep calling everything laziness. Your creativity deserves a more intelligent diagnosis. And if the project matters to you, give yourself one final test. Imagine that nobody will ever see it. Imagine there is no applause at the end. No money, no followers, no recognition, no proof that you were talented. The only thing you get is the experience of having made it. If some part of you still says, "I want this to exist," then listen to that part. Because that is not laziness, that is desire. And desire doesn't always arrive as motivation. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet refusal to let an idea disappear. So make the first ugly version, write the paragraph, record the terrible take, draw the bad sketch, open the file, make the thing smaller, remove the phone, stop waiting to feel ready. You don't need to become a different person before you create. You need to create enough times that the person you are becomes capable of finishing. Because one day, you'll look back at the projects you kept postponing and realize something uncomfortable. The biggest obstacle was never that you lacked ideas. You had too many. It wasn't that you lacked intelligence. You had enough. It wasn't even that you lacked creativity. Creativity was probably the one thing you had in abundance. The problem was that you kept asking your imagination to do the job that only action could do, and imagination can show you the destination. It cannot take the first step for you. So if you're creative but lazy, don't spend another year trying to become less lazy. Find out what you're actually protecting. Find out what you're avoiding. Find out what you're afraid of. Find out whether the dream is really yours. Then make the next step so small that your excuses have nothing left to argue with. Because the world doesn't need another person with 1,000 brilliant ideas trapped inside their head. It needs the person who takes one of those ideas and gives it a body. And maybe that's the real secret. You don't need more inspiration. You need less distance between the idea and the first action. The idea is already there. Now make something real.